Welcome to this profoundly soporific exploration of employment opportunities in ancient Rome. We will examine, in exhaustive and sleep-inducing detail, the various occupations that existed in Roman society, which might be considered desirable by the standards of that era. This journey will be slow, methodical, and deliberately tedious, perfect for lulling you into peaceful slumber. Chapter 1. The Position of Imperial Librarian. Let us begin our survey with the position of Imperial Librarian, a role that combined access to knowledge with relative safety and comfort. The libraries of Rome were not the silent, climate-controlled spaces we know today. They were rooms, sometimes quite large rooms, filled with scrolls stored in wooden cabinets or on shelves. These scrolls were made of papyrus, imported from Egypt at considerable expense, or sometimes of parchment made from animal skins. The librarian's day would begin early, though not as early as a labourer's or a farmer's. He would arrive at the library after dawn, perhaps having eaten a simple breakfast of bread dipped in wine. The first task would be to open the shutters to admit light, as artificial illumination was expensive and used sparingly. Oil lamps could be lit if needed, but oil cost money, so natural light was preferred whenever possible. Once the library was opened, the librarian would survey his domain. He would check that all was in order, that no scrolls had been disturbed by mice or by careless readers from the previous day. Mice were a constant threat to papyrus, as they would chew it for nesting material or simply for sustenance. Various methods were employed to discourage mice. Cats were sometimes kept in libraries, though they brought their own problems of hair and occasional messes. The scrolls themselves were organized according to systems that varied from library to library. Some librarians organized by author, others organized by subject. Still others used a combination of methods, with Greek works separated from Latin works, and within each language further subdivisions by topic or chronology. There were no card catalogues, no computer databases. The librarian had to remember where things were, or consult written lists that he maintained, updating them as new scrolls were acquired or old ones were damaged beyond use. When a patron came to the library seeking a particular work, the librarian would need to locate it. This involved walking to the appropriate section of the library, scanning the labels or tags attached to scrolls, and retrieving the one requested. The labels were small pieces of parchment or papyrus attached to the ends of scrolls with the title and sometimes the author written in ink. These labels could fall off, fade, or be damaged, making identification difficult. The retrieval of scrolls was not always straightforward. Scrolls stored on high shelves required a ladder. The ladders were wooden, often handmade by library staff or by carpenters, hired for the purpose. Climbing these ladders while carrying scrolls was slightly hazardous, as a fall could damage both the librarian and the valuable manuscripts. So the librarian would climb slowly, carefully, moving with deliberate caution. Once the scroll was retrieved, the librarian would present it to the patron. The patron might read it in the library, or, if they were sufficiently important and trusted, might be allowed to borrow it. Borrowed scrolls required record-keeping. The librarian would note in a ledger what scroll was taken by whom and on what date. This ledger was itself a scroll, or later in Roman history might be a codex, an early form of bound book made of pages rather than a continuous roll. The return of scrolls also required record keeping. When a patron returned a borrowed scroll, the librarian would inspect it for damage. Minor wear was expected. Papyrus became brittle with age and handling, but significant damage, tears, stains, illegible, sections, would need to be noted and possibly repaired, or, if repair was impossible, the scroll might need to be copied. Copying scrolls was a major part of a librarian's responsibilities. When scrolls became too damaged to read, or when additional copies were needed because a work was popular, copying had to be done. Sometimes professional scribes were hired for this work. Other times, the librarian would do it himself if he had good handwriting and the patience for the task. The copying process was extraordinarily tedious. The scribe would sit at a table with the original scroll unrolled before him and a blank papyrus roll beside it. He would read a section of the original, perhaps a sentence or a paragraph, and then write it on the new scroll. Then he would read the next section and copy it. This would continue for hours, day after day, until the entire work was copied. The handwriting had to be clear and accurate. Errors in copying could change the meaning of texts, especially in works of philosophy, medicine, or law where precision was important. So the scribe worked slowly, checking his work, comparing what he had written to the original. His hand would cramp. His eyes would tire from the strain of reading and writing in light that, even at its best, was dimmer than modern lighting. The posture required for writing was uncomfortable. Roman scribes typically sat on stools or chairs without backs, leaning over their work. This position, maintained for hours, caused back pain and neck strain. Scribes developed calluses on their fingers where the stylus or pen pressed against the skin. They suffered from headaches caused by eye strain. Despite these discomforts, the work continued because scrolls needed to be copied and the library's collection needed to be maintained. Between copying sessions, the librarian would perform other duties. He would organize incoming acquisitions, new scrolls purchased or donated to the library. These would need to be catalogued, labelled, and shelved in appropriate locations. He would repair minor damage to existing scrolls, using glue made from plant or animal materials to mend tears or reattach loose sections. He would also assist scholars and students using the library. A scholar might ask for recommendations on sources for a particular topic. The librarian, if he was knowledgeable, could suggest relevant works and retrieve them. A student might need help understanding how to properly unroll and roll a scroll without damaging it. Scrolls had to be rolled from one end to the other to read them, and careless handling could tear the papyrus. The library would close at dusk, as reading by lamplight was impractical for extended periods. The librarian would ensure all patrons had left, that all borrowed scrolls were properly recorded, and that the library was secured. Shutters would be closed, doors would be locked. The librarian would then depart, heading home or to whatever evening activities he pursued. The compensation for this work was modest, but reliable. A librarian employed by the imperial household or by a wealthy patron would receive a regular salary, paid in coin. This salary was sufficient to rent reasonable accommodations, to purchase food and clothing, and to maintain a modest but comfortable lifestyle. The librarian was not wealthy, but he was not poor either. He occupied a middle station in Roman society, below the aristocracy and wealthy merchants, but above common labourers and slaves. The social status of the position was respectable. Librarians were educated men, literate in both Latin and often Greek. They associated with scholars, teachers, and sometimes with aristocrats who used the library. This social access provided opportunities for conversation, for learning, and potentially for advancement to other positions through patronage connections. The work was physically easier than most occupations. A librarian did not labour in fields under the hot sun. He did not carry heavy loads through city streets. He did not work with dangerous tools or substances. The worst physical demands were climbing ladders, carrying scrolls, and the strain of prolonged sitting and close work. These were manageable for most people in reasonable health. The intellectual stimulation was considerable. A librarian spent his days surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. He could, in his spare moments, read works of history, philosophy, poetry, and science. This access to learning was a privilege that few Romans enjoyed. Most people were illiterate or had only basic literacy. The librarian lived in a world of texts, ideas, and intellectual discourse that was closed to the majority of the population. Chapter 2: The Role of the Nomenclator. Another desirable position in ancient Rome was that of nomenclator, a personal assistant whose primary responsibility was to remember and whisper the names of people his patron encountered. This might seem like a trivial task, but in Roman society where social connections and reputation were paramount, it was actually quite important. Roman aristocrats and politicians needed to greet people by name. Remembering someone's name and some personal detail about them demonstrated respect and maintained social bonds, but a successful Roman might know hundreds or even thousands of people, clients, fellow aristocrats, business associates, distant relatives, and so on. Remembering all these names and details was impossible for most people. The nomenclator solved this problem. He would walk slightly behind and to the side of his patron as they moved through public spaces, the forum, the baths, the theatre, the streets of Rome. When someone approached, the nomenclator would quickly identify them and whisper their name and relevant information to his patron. Marcus Tullius, your neighbour. His son is studying rhetoric. The patron could then greet Marcus Tullius warmly by name, ask about his son's studies, and create a favourable impression. To perform this function, the nomenclator needed an exceptional memory. He would spend considerable time studying lists of names, reviewing relationships, and memorizing faces. When his patron acquired new clients or met new people at social gatherings, the nomenclator would need to learn their names and commit them to memory. This required concentration and regular practice. The nomenclator would typically begin preparing for his duties early in the morning. He would review his mental catalogue of names and faces, rehearsing them to ensure retention. He might consult written notes or lists, though relying too heavily on written aids was considered poor form. The nomenclator was supposed to remember things, not constantly refer to tablets. When accompanying his patron through the city, the nomenclator needed to remain constantly alert. He needed to scan crowds looking for faces he recognized. He needed to stay close, enough to his patron to whisper information without being overheard by others, but not so close as to crowd his patron or seem overly familiar. This required social awareness and careful positioning. The actual moment of identification and whispering happened quickly. A face would appear in the crowd. The nomenclator would recognize it, recall the name and relevant details, move close to his patron's ear, and whisper the information, all within a few seconds. The patron would then greet the person by name, and the interaction would proceed naturally, with no one else aware that the patron had needed reminding. Errors were embarrassing for everyone involved. If the nomenclator identified someone incorrectly, his patron might greet the wrong person or use the wrong name, causing confusion and potentially offence. If the nomenclator failed to identify someone his patron should know, the patron might pass by without acknowledging them, which could be interpreted as deliberate snubbing and damage relationships. To minimize errors, nomenclators developed various techniques. They would note distinctive features of faces, a particular nose shape, a scar, unusual hair, distinctive clothing preferences. They would create mental associations between names and features. Gaius Antonius has an aquiline nose like an eagle, aquila. These mnemonic devices helped cement memories. They would also gather intelligence. A good nomenclator would talk to other servants, to shopkeepers, to anyone who might provide information about people his patron might encounter. Did you hear that Lucius Cornelius has returned from his estate in Campania? This information allowed the nomenclator to prepare for possible encounters and to provide his patron with current details that would make greetings more meaningful. The working hours for a nomenclator were irregular. He would need to be available whenever his patron went out in public, which could be morning, afternoon, or evening. Roman aristocrats often had busy social schedules, attending meetings in the forum, visiting the baths, dining at friends' homes, and attending public events. The nomenclator would accompany his patron to all of these, always attentive, always ready to whisper a name. Between public outings, the nomenclator might have other duties. He might carry messages for his patron, run errands, or assist with correspondence. But his primary value was his memory and his ability to facilitate social interactions. A patron with an excellent nomenclator had a significant advantage in Roman public life. The compensation for a nomenclator varied depending on the wealth and status of his patron. A nomenclator for a very wealthy senator might be well paid, receiving a good salary plus occasional bonuses and gifts. He might receive cast-off clothing from his patron, which even second-hand would be of good quality. He might eat well from his patron's kitchen. He might accompany his patron on travels to country estates or to other cities, experiencing a lifestyle beyond what his salary alone would provide. The social position of a nomenclator was ambiguous. He was clearly a servant, dependent on his patron's favour. But he was also a trusted confidant who shared his patron's public life intimately. He heard conversations, witnessed meetings, and observed the workings of power. This insider knowledge gave him a form of social capital that other servants lacked. A successful nomenclator might eventually transition to other roles. His demonstrated loyalty, discretion, and competence might lead his patron to assign him more significant responsibilities, managing estates, negotiating business deals, or handling legal matters. Alternatively, the social connections made through years of service might allow the nomenclator to establish himself in business or secure positions with other patrons. The skills required for the position were entirely mental and social, unlike most Roman occupations. Being a nomenclator required no physical strength, no technical skills with tools, no specialized knowledge of agriculture or crafts. What it required was memory, social awareness, discretion, and the ability to remain calm and focused in crowded, chaotic public spaces. These were skills that could be developed through practice, and that could serve a person well in various contexts throughout life. Chapter 3. The Profession of the Rhetor. The rhetor, or teacher of rhetoric, held one of the most intellectually prestigious positions available to Romans who were not of aristocratic birth. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, was central to Roman public life. Success in politics, law, and many other fields required the ability to speak effectively, to construct compelling arguments, and to sway audiences. The rhetor taught these skills. A rhetor would typically establish a school in a rented space, perhaps a room opening onto a colonnade in the forum, or a space in a private building. The school would be furnished simply: benches or chairs for students, a chair or platform for the rhetor, and perhaps some basic materials like wax tablets for students to practice writing. Students would come to the rhetor to learn the principles and practice of effective speaking. These students were typically teenage boys from families wealthy enough to afford education beyond basic literacy. The sons of senators, equestrians, and prosperous merchants would study with a rhetor as preparation for future careers in public life. The curriculum was standardized across most rhetorical schools, following traditions that had been established by Greek teachers and adopted by Romans. Students would learn the 5 parts of rhetoric: invention, developing arguments; arrangement, organizing a speech; style, choosing effective language; memory, memorizing speeches; and delivery, performing speeches effectively. Instruction would proceed systematically. The rhetor would lecture on theoretical principles, explaining the different types of arguments, the structures of different types of speeches, and the techniques for making language more persuasive. These lectures were delivered from memory. The rhetor had learned this material years earlier as a student, and had repeated it countless times to successive classes of students. After lectures, students would practice. They would be assigned exercises called declamations, practice speeches on hypothetical topics. A common exercise was the controversia, where students would argue hypothetical legal cases. A man who has been kidnapped by pirates writes to his father requesting ransom money. The father refuses. The son is executed. Later, the father is prosecuted by the son's brother for moral failure. Should he be convicted? Students would prepare speeches arguing both sides of such cases. The preparation of these speeches would occur partly during class and partly as homework. Students would apply the principles they had learned, developing arguments, organizing them effectively, choosing words carefully, and memorizing the resulting speech. This process took hours of effort for each speech. When a student was ready, he would deliver his speech to the class. The student would stand before his classmates and the rhetor and perform his speech from memory. The rhetor would listen carefully, noting strengths and weaknesses. After the performance, the rhetor would provide detailed feedback. This feedback was the core of the rhetor's teaching. He would praise effective techniques. Your opening was strong, you captured attention immediately. He would identify problems. Your argument in the third section was weak. You need better evidence. He would suggest improvements. Try reorganizing this part. Put your strongest point last for greater impact. The rhetor's corrections were often delivered in a tone that was simultaneously critical and encouraging. Roman education valued discipline and did not shy away from pointing out failures. But a good rhetor also knew that students learned better when they believed they could improve, so the feedback would be direct but constructive, pushing students to work harder while also acknowledging their progress. Classes would meet daily, typically in the morning. A session might last 2 or 3 hours. During this time, multiple students might deliver speeches, receive feedback, and listen to their classmates' performances. The act of listening to others' speeches was itself educational. Students could see what worked and what didn't, learning from both good and bad examples. The rhetor's work extended beyond classroom instruction. He would prepare lectures, reviewing his own notes and thinking about how to explain concepts clearly. He would evaluate student work, reading written exercises, and thinking about how to help each student improve. He would sometimes write model speeches or texts on rhetorical theory, either for his own use or for publication. Successful rhetors could become quite well known. Students who went on to successful careers in politics or law would remember their rhetorical education and would sometimes credit their former teacher publicly. This brought prestige to the rhetor and could attract new students, allowing him to charge higher fees. The fees charged by rhetors varied. A well-established rhetor teaching sons of the aristocracy could command substantial fees, collecting enough to live comfortably and even prosperously. A beginning rhetor or one teaching less wealthy students would earn more modest sums, sufficient for a decent but not luxurious life. The social status of a rhetor was complex. Teaching was respected as an intellectual profession, and educated Romans valued learning. But teaching was also work performed for pay, which lowered its status in a society where the highest prestige went to those who could live off inherited wealth without working. So the rhetor occupied an intermediate position, respected for his knowledge and skills, but not as prestigious as an aristocrat or wealthy landowner. The daily life of a rhetor was intellectually engaging. He spent his time thinking about language, argument, and persuasion. He engaged with students who were often bright and motivated. He participated in a centuries-old tradition of learning that connected him to famous teachers and speakers of the past. This intellectual dimension made the profession appealing to those who valued the life of the mind over physical labour or business pursuits. The physical demands of the profession were minimal. A rhetor stood while lecturing and sat while listening to student speeches, but these activities were not strenuous. The work took place indoors, sheltered from weather. There were no heavy objects to lift, no dangerous tools to use, no exposure to industrial hazards. For someone of scholarly inclination, it was an ideal occupation. Chapter 4. The position of the balnita. The balnita, or bathhouse manager, held a position that combined business management with oversight of one of Rome's most important social institutions. Roman bathhouses were not merely places to bathe, they were social centres where people of all classes came to relax, exercise, socialise and conduct business. Managing a bathhouse was therefore a position of some importance, and, if done well, could be quite profitable. A typical Roman bathhouse contained multiple rooms maintained at different temperatures. There was the frigidarium, the cold room with a cold plunge pool, the tepidarium, a warm room for gradual temperature adjustment, the caldarium, the hot room with hot water pools and often the highest temperature. There was also typically a changing room, an exercise area, and various other spaces depending on the size and luxury of the establishment. The balnita was responsible for ensuring all of these spaces functioned properly. This required managing the heating system, which was one of the most impressive technological features of Roman bathhouses. The Hippocrates system circulated hot air beneath the floors and through hollow spaces in the owls, heating the rooms from below and creating the warm and hot environments that bathers enjoyed. Maintaining the Hippocrates required constant attention. A fire burned continuously in a furnace, typically located in a basement or external chamber. This fire had to be fed with fuel, wood, charcoal, or sometimes coal. Slaves would shovel fuel into the furnace throughout the day, maintaining the temperature. The balnita would need to ensure adequate fuel supplies, which meant purchasing fuel from suppliers and storing it appropriately. The temperature of different rooms needed to be regulated. The caldarium should be hot but not dangerously so. The tepidarium should be pleasantly warm. This regulation was accomplished by adjusting how much heat reached different areas, using dampers or by varying the intensity of the fire. The balnita would need to understand how the system worked and make adjustments as needed, or supervise slaves who performed these tasks. Water supply was another critical concern. Roman bathhouses used enormous quantities of water, which needed to be brought in through aqueducts or pipes, stored in cisterns, heated for the warm and hot pools, and then drained away. The plumbing involved was complex, with lead pipes carrying water to various locations, and drains removing used water. The balnita would need to ensure water flowed properly, that pipes didn't become blocked, that drains functioned, and that water quality was maintained. The water in pools could become dirty from the many bathers using them, so pools needed to be drained and refilled periodically. This meant scheduling times when pools would be out of service, managing the draining and cleaning process, and refilling with fresh water. Staffing was a major responsibility. A bathhouse required many workers, slaves or employees to maintain fires, to clean rooms, to provide attendance for bathers, to guard clothing in changing rooms, to provide massage services, to sell food and drinks, and to perform various other functions. The balnita had to hire, train, supervise, and sometimes discipline this workforce. The business side of managing a bathhouse involved setting admission prices, collecting fees, managing expenses, and hopefully generating profit. Many bathhouses charged nominal admission fees, as they were meant to be accessible to common people. The fee might be a quadrans, a small coin worth a quarter of an X, which even poor Romans could usually afford. Some bathhouses had different fees for different times of day, or offered monthly subscriptions. Additional revenue came from services offered within the bathhouse. Massages cost extra. Food and drink sold in the bathhouse provided income. Some bathhouses rented space to vendors who sold various goods and services. The balnita would need to manage these additional revenue streams, collecting appropriate fees or rents, and ensuring vendors maintained acceptable standards. The schedule of a bathhouse was tied to Roman daily rhythms. Bathhouses typically opened in the afternoon and remained open into the evening. This was after most Romans had completed their daily work and were free for leisure. The morning might be used for maintenance, cleaning, and restocking supplies in preparation for the afternoon and evening crowds. The balneator's own working hours were long. He needed to be present when the bathhouse was open, to supervise operations and handle any problems. He might also need to be involved in morning preparations. This could mean a workday extending from morning until evening, though he might be able to delegate some responsibilities to trusted assistants or head slaves. The social aspects of running a bathhouse were significant. The balneator would interact with patrons of all social classes. He needed to maintain order, ensuring that behaviour remained acceptable, that theft from changing rooms was prevented, and that disputes between patrons were resolved. He also needed to cultivate relationships with important patrons, whose goodwill could bring prestige and additional customers to his establishment. The income from managing a bathhouse could be substantial, especially for a well-located and well-run establishment. Some balneators operated bathhouses they owned outright. Others leased bathhouses from wealthy owners, paying a fixed rent and keeping any profits. Either arrangement could provide good income for someone skilled at managing the complex operations involved. The position required a combination of technical knowledge, business acumen, and people skills. The balneator needed to understand heating systems, plumbing, and building maintenance. He needed to manage money, control costs, and maximize revenue, and he needed to deal with diverse patrons, difficult employees, demanding vendors, and unpredictable situations. It was challenging work, but for someone with the right skills, it could be very rewarding. The physical environment was pleasant. Unlike many Roman occupations, the balneator worked in comfortable temperatures, surrounded by the amenities of the bathhouse. He was clean, well-groomed, and spent his days in spaces designed for comfort and pleasure, rather than in fields, workshops, or other more demanding environments. For someone who enjoyed social interaction and business management, it was an appealing career. Chapter 5. The work of the hortulanus. The hortulanus, or gardener, particularly one who served a wealthy household, enjoyed working conditions that were far superior to those of common agricultural labourers. While farm workers toiled in large fields growing grain and other staple crops, the hortulanus tended ornamental gardens, vegetable gardens and orchards attached to wealthy villas and urban homes. A wealthy Roman household's garden was a source of pride and pleasure. It might contain ornamental plantings, flowers, decorative shrubs, shaped hedges, and trees arranged for aesthetic effect. It would include practical plantings, vegetables for the household's consumption, herbs for cooking and medicine, and fruit trees. Some gardens also contained water features like fountains and ponds, adding to their beauty and providing pleasant sounds. The hortulanus's day would begin early, as most agricultural work did, to take advantage of cooler morning temperatures. He would walk through this garden, inspecting plants for signs of problems. Wilting from insufficient water, damage from insects or disease, weeds that needed to be removed. This inspection was methodical, moving from section to section, noting what needed attention. Watering was a constant task, especially during the dry Roman summer. Large gardens might have irrigation systems, channels that diverted water from streams or aqueducts to flow through the garden. But many plants required individual attention. The hortulanus would carry water in vessels or use a watering can, directing water to the base of each plant. This was repetitive, somewhat tedious work, but it was not particularly strenuous, and it had a meditative quality. Weeding was another regular task. Weeds competed with desired plants for water, nutrients, and light. They also made the garden look untidy, which was unacceptable in a household that took pride in its grounds. The hortulanus would move through garden beds, pulling or digging out weeds, depositing them in a basket or pile to be removed later. This required bending and kneeling, which could be hard on the back and knees, but the work was done at a self-directed pace without the urgency that characterized other forms of labor. Pruning was a skilled task that the hortulanus would perform regularly. Trees and shrubs needed to be shaped to maintain their form and to promote healthy growth. The hortulanus would use shears or small saws to remove dead branches, to thin growth that was too dense, and to shape plantings according to the aesthetic preferences of the household or according to traditional forms. This work required judgment and experience, knowing where to cut, how much to remove, what the plant could tolerate. Planting new specimens was done seasonally. In spring, vegetable seeds would be planted in prepared beds. In appropriate seasons, new ornamental plants would be installed to replace ones that had died or to introduce new varieties. The hortulanus would prepare the soil, digging holes of appropriate size, positioning plants carefully, backfilling with soil and watering thoroughly. He might stake plants that needed support, providing poles or trellises for climbing plants, or for specimens that might be damaged by wind. Pest control was an ongoing challenge. Insects would attack plants, eating leaves or boring into stems. Diseases would cause discoloration, wilting, or death. The hortulanus would use various methods to combat these problems. He might pick insects off by hand, dropping them into a container of water or oil. He might apply substances that deterred pests, various plant extracts or mixtures that had been found effective through experience. He might prune away diseased portions of plants, removing the affected material to prevent spread. The harvesting of produce was one of the more satisfying aspects of the work. As vegetables ripened, the hortulanus would pick them and deliver them to the household's kitchen. As fruit matured on trees, he would harvest it, sometimes using ladders to reach higher branches. This harvest was evidence of successful cultivation, tangible results of months of care and attention. The hortulanus would also maintain garden structures and features. Paths needed to be kept clear and sometimes resurfaced. Fences and trellises needed repairs. Water features required cleaning to prevent algae growth and to keep water flowing properly. Garden furniture, benches and tables where the household might sit to enjoy the garden, needed to be maintained. These tasks added variety to the work and required some basic carpentry and maintenance skills. The relationship between the hortulanus and the household was typically cordial. Gardens were places of beauty and relaxation that the household valued. A hortulanus who maintained an attractive, productive garden earned appreciation and respect. The householder might walk through the garden in the evening, commenting on plantings, asking questions about particular plants, or making requests for changes or additions. These interactions were generally pleasant, lacking the harshness that often characterized relationships between masters and slaves, or employers and laborers in less favored positions. The compensation for a hortulanus employed by a wealthy household could be quite good. In addition to wages, the hortulanus might receive housing, perhaps a small dwelling on the estate or within the household complex. He would have access to food, either receiving rations or being allowed to eat with other household staff. He might be given surplus produce from the garden for his own use or sale. These additional benefits supplemented his wages and improved his standard of living. The social status of a hortulanus was respectable. Gardening required knowledge and skill. It was associated with beauty, refinement, and the lifestyle of the wealthy rather than with mere subsistence agriculture. A hortulanus could take pride in his work, seeing immediate results in the form of beautiful gardens and abundant produce. He was not just a labourer, but a craftsman of sorts, applying expertise to create something of value and beauty. The physical demands of the work were moderate. There was bending, kneeling, lifting, and carrying involved, but these were not extreme. The work was performed outdoors in pleasant surroundings. Gardens were designed to be beautiful and comfortable spaces. The hortulanus worked with living things, experiencing the rhythms of seasons, the satisfaction of nurturing growth, and the beauty of flowers and foliage. For someone who enjoyed working with plants and being outdoors, it was an excellent occupation. Chapter 6. The Role of the Archarius. The Archarius, or treasurer, was responsible for managing money and financial records for wealthy households, businesses, or public institutions. This position required literacy, numeracy, and trustworthiness, and it came with significant responsibility and generally good compensation. In a large Roman household, money flowed in and out constantly. Income came from various sources: rents from properties, returns from business investments, agricultural produce sold from estates, and so on. Expenses were equally diverse: household provisions, wages for staff, maintenance of buildings, taxes, entertainment costs, gifts, and numerous other outlays. Managing these flows of money required careful record-keeping and sound judgment. The Archarius would maintain accounts, recording income and expenditure. This was done using wax tablets for daily transactions and more permanent records on papyrus or parchment for final accounts. Roman numerals were used for the numbers, making arithmetic more challenging than it would be with modern notation, but experienced archari developed facility with calculation and could add, subtract, and perform more complex operations with reasonable speed. Each transaction would be recorded with the date, the amount, the source or destination of the money, and a brief description. 15 days before the calends of Martius received 30 denarii from the rent of the shop near the Forum. 12 days before the calends of Martius paid 5 denarii to the baker for 3 days' supply of bread for the household. These entries accumulated day after day, creating a detailed record of financial activity. Periodically, the Archarius would compile summary accounts. These might be monthly or annual summaries showing total income and expenditure by category. Creating these summaries required reviewing all the individual entries, categorizing them, totaling each category, and presenting the results in clear format. This work was tedious, requiring careful attention to avoid errors, but it was essential for understanding the financial position of the household or organization. The archarius was also responsible for the physical money itself. Coins would be stored in a strong box or safe, typically made of heavy wood with metal reinforcement and secured with locks. The archarius would have the keys to this strong box, making him directly responsible for its contents. This was a position of significant trust. The archarius had access to substantial sums and could, if dishonest, steal or misappropriate funds. When money needed to be paid out, the archarius would unlock the strongbox, count out the appropriate amount, record the payment in his accounts, and deliver the money or give it to someone authorized to make the payment. When money came in, he would count it, verify the amount, record it, and add it to the strongbox. This counting and verification was done carefully, as errors could lead to shortages that the archarius might be held responsible for. Security was a constant concern. The strongbox was kept in a secure location, often in a room that could be locked. The archarius would need to be vigilant against theft, whether from outsiders or from other members of the household staff. He might sleep near the strongbox or arrange for guards if the sums involved were particularly large. The responsibility for security added stress to the position, but also underscored its importance. The archarius would interact regularly with the head of the household, reporting on financial matters, seeking approval for large expenditures, and providing information about the financial position. These interactions required the ability to communicate clearly, to present information in understandable form, and to answer questions about specific transactions or trends in income and expenditure. In addition to managing money, the archarius might be involved in other administrative tasks. He might maintain inventories of household goods, recording what was stored in warehouses or storerooms. He might handle correspondence related to financial matters, writing letters to tenants about rent, to debtors about payments owed, or to suppliers about purchases. This extended his role beyond purely financial functions into general administration. The skills required for the position were primarily mental. The archarius needed to be literate and numerate, able to read, write, and perform calculations. He needed to be organized, maintaining orderly records that could be referenced when questions arose. He needed to be trustworthy, as he handled money and had many opportunities for dishonesty. And he needed to be discreet, as he knew details about the household's finances that should not be shared outside the household. The compensation for an archarius was generally good, reflecting the importance of the position and the skills required. Salary would be paid regularly, typically monthly. The archarius might also receive bonuses or gifts, especially at year-end or when financial results were particularly good. Housing might be provided, or if not, the salary would be sufficient to rent decent accommodations. Food might be provided through the household's kitchen or through a food allowance. The social status of an archarius was respectable. Financial management was recognized as requiring intelligence and trustworthiness. An archarius was not a mere servant, but a valued staff member whose skills were essential to the household's functioning. He might dine with other senior household staff rather than with common labourers. He might be addressed respectfully by other staff members. His advice on financial matters might be sought and valued. the working conditions were comfortable. The Arcarius worked indoors, typically in an office or study where records were kept. He sat at a table or desk, worked with pen and ink or stylus and wax tablets, and spent his days in a clean, quiet environment. There was no heavy physical labour, no exposure to weather or industrial hazards, no dirty or dangerous tasks. For someone of scholarly inclination with aptitude for numbers, it was an ideal occupation. The career prospects were good. A successful Arcarius might be promoted to oversee a larger household or a more complex operation. He might be given responsibility for managing an entire estate or multiple properties. The skills he developed were transferable. Financial management was needed in many contexts, and an experienced Arcarius could find employment with different families or organizations if he wished to change positions. Chapter 7. The position of the Villicus. The Villicus, or estate manager, oversaw agricultural operations on rural estates owned by wealthy Romans. This was a position of considerable authority and responsibility, combining agricultural expertise with management skills. A good Villicus was highly valued and could earn substantial compensation, along with respect from both the landowner and the agricultural workers he supervised. Roman estates varied greatly in size. Some were modest farms of a few dozen acres. Others were vast latifundia covering hundreds or thousands of acres and employing hundreds of slaves and tenant farmers. Regardless of size, estates needed management, and this was the Villicus's role. The Villicus's responsibilities began with planning the agricultural year. Different crops needed to be planted at different times. Fields needed to be rotated to maintain soil fertility. Grain one year, legumes the next, perhaps left fallow the third year. The Villicus would decide what to plant where, based on soil conditions, market demands, and the landowner's preferences. Once planting plans were made, the Villicus would organise the labour force to implement them. Fields needed to be ploughed, which required workers to guide oxen or other draft animals pulling ploughs. Seeds needed to be sown, either broadcast by hand or planted in rows. Young plants might need to be transplanted. All of this required directing workers, assigning tasks and supervising their execution. During the growing season, the Villicus would monitor crop development. He would inspect fields regularly, looking for problems: insufficient water, weed pressure, pest damage, disease. He would organize responses to problems, arranging irrigation if possible, assigning workers to weed fields, applying whatever remedies were available for pests and diseases. This ongoing attention was essential to successful harvests. Harvest time was the most intense period of the agricultural year. Crops needed to be harvested promptly when they reached maturity. Delays could result in losses from weather damage, bird predation, or over-ripening. The Villicus would organize harvesting crews, ensuring sufficient workers were available and that they worked efficiently. For grain, this meant cutting the stalks with sickles, bundling them, and transporting them to threshing areas. For other crops, different procedures applied, but all required organization and supervision. After harvest, crops needed to be processed and stored. Grain needed to be threshed to separate kernels from chaff, then winnowed to remove the chaff, then stored in dry facilities to prevent spoilage. Grapes needed to be pressed to make wine. Olives needed to be pressed for oil. These processing activities were labour-intensive and needed careful oversight to ensure quality and prevent waste. The villicus was also responsible for maintaining buildings and equipment. Barns, storage buildings, and worker housing needed repairs. Tools wore out and needed replacement or repair. Animals needed care, feeding, veterinary attention when sick, and oversight of breeding. The villicus would either perform these maintenance tasks himself or assign them to workers with appropriate skills. Record keeping was an important part of the villicus's duties. He would maintain accounts of production, how much grain harvested, how much wine made, how many animals born or slaughtered. He would record sales of produce and expenses for seeds, tools, and other inputs. These records would be reported to the landowner, providing information about the estate's productivity and profitability. The villicus needed to manage relationships with various people. He supervised the workers on the estate, which might include slaves owned by the landowner and free tenant farmers who rented plots. Different approaches were needed for different workers. Slaves needed direction and sometimes discipline, but also needed to be kept healthy and adequately fed to maintain productivity. Tenant farmers had more autonomy, but needed to meet their obligations to deliver crops or pay rent. The villicus also interacted with the landowner, who might visit the estate periodically. During these visits, the villicus would report on operations, seek approval for significant decisions, and discuss plans for the coming season. The quality of these interactions affected the villicus's standing. A landowner who was satisfied with the estate management would reward and retain a good villicus, while one who was dissatisfied might replace him. Trade was another aspect of the role. The estate produced crops that needed to be sold. The villicus might take produce to local markets or arrange for merchants to come to the estate to purchase bulk quantities. Negotiating fair prices required knowledge of market conditions and some bargaining skill. The villicus wanted to get good prices to maximize the estate's income, but also needed to maintain relationships with regular buyers. The compensation for a villicus was generally good. He would receive a salary, often paid annually or quarterly. He might also receive a share of the estate's production, a portion of the harvest, some wine, olive oil, or other products. Housing was typically provided. The villicus might live in the villa building itself, or in a separate manager's residence on the estate. Food would be provided from the estate's production. These benefits made the position quite comfortable materially. The social status of the villicus was intermediate. He was clearly below the landowner in the social hierarchy, but above the agricultural workers. He occupied a position of authority and responsibility. He needed to be literate and numerate to keep records. He needed agricultural knowledge and management skills. This combination of attributes placed him in a respected middle position in rural society. The daily work of a villicus was varied. Some days involved physical labour, inspecting fields on foot, helping with difficult tasks, working alongside labourers to demonstrate techniques. Other days involved administrative work, updating records, writing reports, planning operations. Still other days involved business activities, negotiating sales, purchasing supplies, meeting with the landowner. This variety made the work interesting and engaging rather than monotonously repetitive. The challenges of the position were real but manageable. Weather was unpredictable and could damage crops. Workers might be lazy or incompetent, requiring supervision and sometimes discipline. Markets fluctuated, affecting the profitability of production. These challenges required judgment, experience, and sometimes just patience to endure difficulties that could not be controlled. For someone with agricultural knowledge and management ability who wanted to live at the countryside while having significant responsibility and reasonable comfort, the position of Villicus was excellent. It offered material security, social respect, intellectual engagement through problem solving, and the satisfaction of overseeing productive operations that fed people and generated wealth. Chapter 8. The work of the medicus. The medicus, or physician, occupied a complex position in Roman society. Medicine in ancient Rome was not scientific in the modern sense, but it was a respected profession that required study, skill, and provided service to those suffering from illness and injury. For someone with intellectual ability and an interest in helping others, it was a worthwhile career. Medical training in Rome was typically apprenticeship-based rather than institutional. A young man who wanted to become a physician would attach himself to an established medicus, assisting him in his work and gradually learning the theory and practice of medicine. This apprenticeship might last several years, during which the student would observe treatments, prepare medicines, assist with procedures, and eventually begin treating patients under supervision. The theoretical basis of Roman medicine came largely from Greek sources. The theories of Hippocrates and Galen explained disease as resulting from imbalances in the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment aimed to restore proper balance through various means: diet, exercise, bloodletting, purging, and herbal medicines. While this theoretical framework was incorrect by modern standards, it provided a logical structure for diagnosis and treatment. A medicus's daily work would involve seeing patients. In a city like Rome, a physician might have a medical office where patients would come for consultation. The consultation would begin with the patient describing their symptoms. The medicus would ask questions to gather more information. When did the symptoms start? What makes them better or worse? Have you had this before? These questions helped the medicus form a diagnosis. Physical examination was part of the diagnostic process. The medicus would look at the patient, observing their colour, posture, and any visible signs of disease. He would feel the patient's pulse, which was believed to provide important information about the body's state. He might examine specific areas of concern, looking at a rash, feeling a painful area, listening to breathing sounds. This hands-on examination required some physical contact with patients, which was acceptable in their medical context. Based on the consultation and examination, the medicus would form a diagnosis. This diagnosis was couched in terms of humoral theory. You have an excess of phlegm, or your blood is too thick, and would suggest the appropriate treatment. The treatment might be dietary changes. Eat less meat and more vegetables for the next month. It might be herbal medicine. Take this preparation of willow bark twice daily for pain. It might be procedural. I need to let some blood to reduce the excess. The preparation of medicines was an important part of medical practice. The medicus would need knowledge of herbs and other substances with medicinal properties. He would prepare various remedies, decoctions made by boiling herbs in water, infusions made by steeping herbs, poultices applied to the skin, pills or powders to be taken orally. This preparation required care in measuring ingredients, knowing how to process different substances, and understanding how to store medicines to maintain their effectiveness. Some medical procedures were surgical. The medicus might need to set broken bones, applying splints and bandages to keep bones aligned while they healed. He might need to treat wounds, cleaning them, sometimes stitching them closed, and dressing them to prevent infection. He might need to perform simple operations, removing growths, draining abscesses, extracting teeth. These procedures were performed without anesthesia except perhaps wine or opium to dull the pain, making them ordeal for both patient and physician. The medicus would also provide advice on healthy living. He might counsel patients about diet, exercise, sleep, and other aspects of lifestyle that affected health. This advice drew on the belief that health depended on proper balance, and that many diseases could be prevented or treated through appropriate lifestyle choices. A patient suffering from digestive problems might be told to eat simpler foods, to take walks after meals, and to avoid excessive wine consumption. House calls were part of many physicians' practices. Wealthy patients, especially when seriously ill, would summon the medicus to their homes. The physician would travel to the patient's residence, bringing his medical bag with instruments and medicines. He would examine the patient in their sick room, prescribe treatment, and sometimes stay to administer care or supervise its administration by household staff or family members. The financial arrangements for medical care varied. Wealthy patients would pay substantial fees for medical services. The amount might be negotiated, with the physician requesting payment that reflected the patient's means and the complexity of the case. Poor patients might receive charity care, as many physicians felt an ethical obligation to help those who could not pay. Some physicians worked on retainer for wealthy families, receiving a regular salary in exchange for providing care as needed. The social status of physicians was mixed. Medicine was respected as a learned profession requiring intelligence and education. Physicians who successfully treated important patients could become well known and highly regarded. However, medicine also involved working with the body in ways that could seem degrading, touching diseased or injured flesh, dealing with bodily fluids, witnessing suffering, and medical treatment often failed to cure disease, which could damage a physician's reputation. The challenges of medical practice were significant. Many diseases could not be effectively treated with available methods. Patients would die despite the physician's best efforts. Some patients would blame the physician for these deaths, refusing to pay or even threatening violence. The physician had to cope with these failures, learning from them when possible, but also accepting that medicine had limits. The intellectual satisfactions of medicine were considerable. Each patient presented a puzzle: what was causing their symptoms, what treatment might help. The physician could apply his knowledge, make observations, formulate hypotheses, and test treatments. When treatment succeeded, there was the satisfaction of having relieved suffering and restored health. Even when treatments failed, there was the knowledge that an attempt had been made to help. The working conditions were variable. Some days involved seeing patients in a comfortable office. Other days required travelling through the city or countryside on house calls. The work was rarely physically strenuous except during surgical procedures or when assisting seriously ill patients. It was mentally demanding, requiring concentration, memory, and judgment. But for someone intellectually inclined, this was more feature than bug. For someone with aptitude for learning, interest in how the body worked, and desire to help others, medicine was a worthwhile profession. It offered intellectual engagement, social service, and the possibility of earning good income while gaining respect for one's skills and knowledge. Chapter 9. The Role of the Scriba. The scriba, or scribe, was a professional writer and record keeper who served various governmental, legal, and business functions. In a society where literacy was limited and bureaucracy was growing, scribes were essential, and the position offered steady employment with decent compensation and respectable status. Scribes worked in multiple contexts. Some were employed by governmental magistrates, recording official proceedings, maintaining public records, and drafting documents. Others worked for legal professionals, copying legal documents and maintaining files of cases and precedents. Still others worked privately, offering writing services to anyone who needed documents prepared. Contracts, wills, letters, petitions, and so on. The daily work of a scriba involved much sitting and writing. He would sit at a table or desk with his writing materials before him. For temporary notes and drafts he might use wax tablets, wooden boards with shallow wells filled with wax on which text could be inscribed with a stylus, and later erased by smoothing the wax. For permanent documents he would use papyrus or parchment, writing with a reed pen, dipped in ink made from carbon black mixed with gum and water. The act of writing required skill and care. The pen had to be held at the correct angle, with proper pressure to produce clear letters without tearing the papyrus. The writing needed to be legible, letters properly formed, words properly spaced, lines straight and evenly spaced. For formal documents, the writing needed to be beautiful, elegant letter forms, consistent proportions, pleasing overall appearance. Developing this skill took years of practice. A scribe needed to write in multiple styles. Official documents required a formal traditional script. Personal letters might use a more cursive, casual style that was faster to write. Different types of documents had conventional formats that the scribe needed to know: where the date went, how to begin the text, how to end it, where signatures or seals should be placed. Knowledge of these conventions was part of the scribe's professional expertise. Beyond mere writing, scribes needed knowledge of correct language. They needed good spelling, proper grammar, and appropriate vocabulary for different contexts. Legal documents required legal terminology used correctly. Business documents needed precise language to avoid ambiguity. Personal letters needed to be written in the appropriate tone for the relationship between the sender and recipient. This linguistic knowledge distinguished a good scribe from a merely competent one. Copying texts was a major part of many scribes' work. Books, in the form of scrolls or later codices, were produced by hand copying. A scribe would sit with an original text before him and a blank scroll beside it. He would read a section of the original and copy it onto the new scroll. This process continued section by section until the entire work was copied. The copying of text required intense concentration. Errors were easy to make. Skipping words, transposing letters, misreading the original. The scribe needed to work slowly and carefully, constantly checking his work against the original. Long copying sessions could be exhausting, his eyes tired from reading and hands cramped from writing. But the work continued because texts needed to be copied. There was no other way to reproduce them. When working for governmental magistrates, the scribe would attend meetings and legal proceedings, taking notes on what was said and decided. These notes would later be written up in formal form as official records. The scribe needed to write quickly enough to capture important information while discussions proceeded, but not so quickly that his writing became illegible. This required a kind of shorthand, abbreviated writing that could later be expanded into full text. The scribe would also maintain files and archives. Documents needed to be stored in an organized way so they could be found when needed. This meant labeling documents, arranging them systematically, perhaps by date, or by subject, or by the names of parties involved, and storing them in chests, on shelves, or in pigeonholes. When someone needed to consult an old document, the scribe would need to locate it, which required knowing or being able to determine where it had been filed. In private practice, a scribe would receive clients who needed documents prepared. A merchant might come needing a contract drafted for a business agreement. The scribe would discuss the terms with the merchant, write them in appropriate legal language, produce a clean copy on papyrus or parchment, and receive payment for the service. An illiterate person might come needing a letter written to a relative in another city. The scribe would take dictation or help the person compose appropriate text, write the letter, seal it, and again receive payment. The fees charged by scribes varied with the complexity and length of documents. A simple letter might cost a few small coins. A complex legal document might cost substantially more. Copying a long text might be priced by the page or by the total length. These fees provided the scribe's income, which, if he had sufficient clients, could be quite adequate. The working conditions for a scribe were generally good. The work was performed indoors, seated in a comfortable position at a table or desk. The environment was quiet and conducive to concentration. There was no physical labour beyond the relatively light demands of writing. There were no dangerous tools, no hazardous materials, no exposure to weather or industrial risks. For someone who enjoyed working with language and had the patience for detailed, careful work, it was an excellent occupation. The social status of scribes was respectable. Literacy was valued, and scribes were among the literate minority. They provided essential services that others could not perform for themselves. They often worked closely with important people, magistrates, lawyers, wealthy merchants, which gave them access to information and social networks that could be valuable. A scribe was not wealthy or powerful, but he was respected as a skilled professional. The career prospects for a good scribe were reasonable. A scribe who developed a reputation for accuracy, efficiency, and discretion could build a substantial clientele. He might be retained by wealthy families or businesses to handle all their documentation needs. He might be appointed to governmental positions that provided steady salaries and the security of public employment. The skills developed as a scribe, writing, language, organization, attention to detail, were valuable in various contexts and could lead to other opportunities. Chapter 10. the position of the exensus. The exensus was an attendant who served Roman magistrates, performing various duties that supported the magistrate's public functions. The position combined elements of personal assistant, ceremonial attendant, and administrative helper. While not glamorous, it provided proximity to power and opportunity for advancement through patronage. A Roman magistrate, whether a consul, praetor, quaestor, or aedile, had significant public responsibilities and conducted much business in public settings. The exensus attended the magistrate during these public appearances, providing support in various ways. One important function was simply being present. Roman officials were expected to appear in public with appropriate dignity and ceremony. Having attendance was part of this display. The exensus would walk with the magistrate through the forum or other public spaces, his presence indicating the magistrate's importance and status. This might seem like a trivial role, but in a society that valued appearances and public display, it mattered. The exensus would carry items for the magistrate. This might include documents that would be needed for the day's business, lists of cases to be heard, correspondence to be reviewed, texts of laws or regulations to be consulted. These documents would be written on wax tablets or papyrus scrolls, and the exensus would be responsible for keeping track of them and producing them when the magistrate needed them. During official proceedings, the exensus might announce speakers or read out documents. If the magistrate was hearing legal cases, litigants would need to present their arguments. The exensus might call them forward. Marcus Tullius Cicero, you may speak. If a document needed to be read into the record, the exensus might read it aloud, projecting his voice so all present could hear. This required clear speech and the ability to read fluently, even when texts were in formal legal language. The exensus would also manage access to the magistrate. Many people wanted the magistrate's attention, clients seeking favours, litigants wanting hearings, people with complaints or petitions. The exensus served as a kind of filter, determining who would be admitted to see the magistrate and when. This required judgment about the relative importance and urgency of different requests, and the ability to say no to people whose requests were deemed less pressing. Record keeping was another responsibility. The exensus would take notes during proceedings, recording decisions made, actions taken, and information that would need to be remembered or followed up on later. These notes would be written on wax tablets in abbreviated form, then might be transcribed more formally later by scribes. But the initial note-taking during proceedings was the exensus's responsibility. The exensus would run errands for the magistrate. This might involve delivering messages to other officials, summoning people to meetings, or fetching documents from archives. These errands required walking through the city, sometimes considerable distances, carrying messages or items and ensuring they reached their intended recipients. The exensus needed to be reliable and trustworthy, as he often carried sensitive information or valuable items during public ceremonies and religious observances. The exensus would attend the magistrate, participating in processions, assisting with ritual actions, and generally ensuring that ceremonial duties were performed correctly. Roman public life involved numerous religious ceremonies, and magistrates often had roles in these. The exensus needed to understand proper protocols and help the magistrate fulfill religious responsibilities without errors that might be seen as bad omens. The relationship between an exensus and his magistrate could become quite close. Working together daily, sharing the pressures and demands of public office, the magistrate might come to rely on his exensus and to trust his discretion and judgment. This relationship could be valuable to the exensus, as a satisfied magistrate might provide recommendations, assistance in finding other positions, or direct support for the exensus's own career advancement. The magistrate's term of office was typically 1 year, after which a new magistrate would be elected. This meant that the exensus's employment was potentially temporary. However, a good exensus might be retained by the next magistrate, or might be recommended to another official, or might be appointed to a more permanent administrative position based on the experience and connections gained while serving as an exensus. The compensation for an exensus was modest but regular. He would receive a salary paid from public funds or sometimes from the magistrate's personal resources. The amount was sufficient to live on, though not lavish. The exensus was not poorly paid, but he was not wealthy from his salary alone. The real value of the position was the experience, the connections, and the potential for advancement rather than immediate financial reward. The social status of an exensus was intermediate. He was a public servant, which carried some prestige. He worked closely with important officials, which gave him reflected status, but he was clearly subordinate, performing service functions rather than wielding power directly. Still, he was far above common labourers or slaves, and his literacy and public role placed him in respectable social territory. The working hours were long and somewhat unpredictable. When the magistrate had public duties, the exensus needed to be present. This might mean early morning starts for ceremonies, long days in the forum hearing cases or conducting public business, and sometimes evening activities related to official functions. The exensus needed to be available when needed, which could be demanding, but the work itself was not physically strenuous. The skills developed as an exensus were valuable. He learned how government functioned, how public officials conducted their duties, how to manage administrative tasks, and how to deal with people from all social levels. These skills and this experience could lead to other positions in government administration, in the households of wealthy families, or in business where knowledge of how government worked was valuable. For someone who wanted to be involved in public life, who had some education and ambition, and who was willing to start in a supporting role with the hope of advancing to more significant positions, serving as an exensus was a reasonable choice. It offered a foothold in Roman public life, steady employment, and opportunities to make connections that could prove valuable throughout a career. Chapter 11. The Trade of the Argentarius. The Argentarius, or banker, held a position that combined financial expertise with business acumen. Banking in ancient Rome was a specialized profession that served both wealthy individuals and merchants engaged in trade. For someone with mathematical ability and commercial instincts, it offered good income and a central position in the economic life of the city. The banker's place of business was typically a table or booth in the forum or another busy commercial area. This table, called a mensa, served as both office and symbol of the trade. The banker would sit at his table during business hours, conducting transactions with clients who approached him. The primary function of a banker was money changing. Rome's economy involved coins of many types, Roman coins of various denominations, coins from provinces and client kingdoms, older coins that remained in circulation, foreign coins brought by merchants. These coins had different weights, different metal content, and different values. Merchants and travellers needed to exchange one type of coin for another, and the banker provided this service. The process of money changing required expertise. The banker needed to recognize different coin types and know their relative values. He needed to be able to detect counterfeit or debased coins, those that looked genuine but contained less precious metal than they should. He would test suspicious coins by weighing them on precision scales, or by using various other methods developed through experience. When a client brought coins to exchange, the banker would examine them, calculate their value, and provide the equivalent in the type of coin the client wanted. The banker would charge a fee for this service, typically a small percentage of the amount exchanged. This fee, multiplied by many transactions, provided a significant portion of the banker's income. The banker also accepted deposits. A wealthy person might deposit money with a banker for safekeeping rather than keeping large sums at home where they risk theft. The banker would record the deposit in his account books, noting the amount and the date. The depositor could later withdraw the money, or could transfer it to others by instructing the banker to pay funds from their account. These deposits served as a form of lending capital for the banker, while the depositor's money sat in the banker's strong box. The banker could lend it to others, charging interest on loans. The difference between the interest earned on loans and any interest paid to depositors constituted profit for the banker. This practice, fundamental to modern banking, already existed in ancient Rome. Lending money was a major part of banking business. Merchants might borrow to finance trading ventures. Landowners might borrow to purchase property or develop estates. Individuals might borrow for various personal reasons. The banker would evaluate each potential loan, assessing the borrower's ability to repay and the security offered, collateral in the form of property, goods, or guarantees from third parties. If the banker agreed to make a loan, terms would be negotiated. The amount, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, and the collateral would all be specified in a written contract. Interest rates varied widely depending on the risk the banker perceived. A loan to a wealthy, established merchant backed by substantial collateral might carry interest of 6 or 8% per year. A riskier loan might command 12, 18, or even higher rates. The collection of loan repayments required record keeping and follow-up. The banker would note when payments were due and would contact borrowers as dates approached. If payments were late, the banker would pursue collection, first through friendly reminders, then through more forceful demands, and ultimately through legal action if necessary. This collection work was sometimes unpleasant, as people who owed money were often reluctant to pay and might become hostile when pressed. The banker also facilitated transfers of funds over distance. A merchant in Rome who owed money to a merchant in Alexandria could avoid the risk of transporting coin by using the banker's services. The Roman merchant would pay the banker in Rome. The banker would send a letter to a colleague or correspondent banker in Alexandria, instructing him to pay the specified amount to the Alexandria merchant. The two bankers would later settle accounts between themselves. This system enabled trade without requiring the physical transport of large sums of money over dangerous routes. The documentation of banking transactions was extensive. The banker maintained account books, recording deposits, withdrawals, loans, repayments, exchanges, and transfers. These books were written on wax tablets for daily transactions and periodically transcribed to more permanent records on papyrus or parchment. The accuracy of these records was essential, as they were the basis for all financial dealings and might be examined if disputes arose. The banker's day began early and ended late. He needed to be at his table in the forum when commercial activity began, which was early morning. He would remain there through most of the day, available to clients. Only during the midday break, when much of the city rested during the heat of afternoon, might he close his operations temporarily. He would reopen in the later afternoon and remain until business activity declined in the evening. The work required constant attention. The banker needed to be alert to opportunities and risks. He needed to evaluate potential borrowers quickly, making judgments about creditworthiness based on limited information. He needed to keep track of numerous accounts, remembering who owed what and when payments were due. He needed to manage his own liquidity, ensuring he had sufficient coin on hand to meet withdrawal demands while keeping as much as possible lent out to earn interest. The banker faced significant risks. Borrowers might default on loans, leaving the banker with losses. Economic downturns could cause many defaults simultaneously, potentially bankrupting the banker. Counterfeit coins might slip through his detection methods, causing losses when others refused to accept them. Robbery was always a possibility, carrying money to and from his table or having it stolen from his storage location. Despite these risks, successful bankers could become quite wealthy. The combination of fees from money changing, interest from loans, and profits from various other financial services could generate substantial income. A banker who managed risk well, who developed a reputation for fairness and reliability, and who built relationships with wealthy clients could accumulate significant capital over the years. The social status of bankers was complicated. They were businessmen, which placed them below the aristocracy who disdained commerce. But successful bankers were often wealthy, and wealth commanded respect. They dealt with powerful people, senators who needed loans, merchants conducting major trade, officials managing public finances. This gave them influence and social access that purely labor-based occupations never achieved. The occupation required certain personal qualities. Mathematical ability was essential. The banker needed to calculate exchange rates, interest charges, and account balances quickly and accurately. Judgment was crucial. Assessing credit risk, detecting fraud, reading people's characters and intentions. Discretion was important. Banking involved confidential financial information that should not be shared, and toughness was valuable. The banker needed to insist on repayment even when borrowers pleaded hardship or became angry. For someone with these qualities, banking offered an opportunity to prosper through intelligence and skill, rather than through physical labor or inherited status. It was mentally demanding work performed in a public setting, engaging with the commercial life of Rome, participating in the financial mechanisms that enabled trade and development. The successful banker served a genuine economic function while earning rewards proportional to his contribution. It was, by most standards, a very good occupation. Chapter 12. The Work of the Negotiator. The negotiator was a businessman engaged in wholesale trade. Unlike shopkeepers who sold directly to consumers, negotiators dealt in bulk commodities and goods, buying from producers and selling to retailers or other merchants. This position required capital, commercial knowledge, and relationships, but it could be quite profitable for those who managed it well. The negotiator's day might begin at the docks or warehouses where goods arrived in Rome. Ships from Egypt brought grain, ships from Spain brought wine, olive oil, and metals. Ships from the eastern Mediterranean brought luxury goods, fine cloth, spices, perfumes. The negotiator would inspect these goods, evaluate their quality, and negotiate purchase prices with the importers or ship captains who brought them. The inspection of goods was critical. A cargo of grain might contain wheat mixed with inferior grains or even debris. Wine might be of poor quality, beginning to turn to vinegar. Cloth might be flawed or not as fine as claimed. The negotiator needed to be able to assess quality quickly, drawing on experience and sometimes on specialized knowledge or assistance from experts in particular commodities. Once quality was assessed, negotiations would begin. The seller would name a price. The negotiator would counter with a lower offer. Discussion would ensue, with each party justifying their position. The seller would point to the quality of the goods, the costs of transport, the market demand. The negotiator would note flaws in the goods, mention other sources of supply, suggest that demand was weak. This bargaining could take considerable time, sometimes hours for a major transaction. When agreement was reached, the transaction would be formalized. A contract might be written specifying the goods, the quantity, the price, the payment terms, and the delivery arrangements. This contract would be signed or sealed by both parties. Payment might be immediate, in coin, or through transfer via a banker. Or payment might be deferred, with the negotiator promising to pay within a specified period, 30 days, 60 days, whatever was agreed. The negotiator would then arrange for the goods to be transported to his warehouse, or to wherever they would be stored until resale. This might involve hiring labourers to move the goods, arranging carts or boats for transport, and ensuring the goods arrived safely without theft or damage. All of this required organisation, and often required the negotiator to be physically present to supervise, ensuring his interests were protected. Storage of goods required warehouse space. The negotiator might own warehouses or might rent space from others. The warehouses needed to be secure against theft and suitable for the goods stored, dry for grain, cool for wine, protected from vermin for valuable cloth or other materials. The negotiator would need to pay rent if leasing space, and would need to arrange for guards or other security measures to protect valuable inventory. The resale of goods was the final stage and the source of the negotiator's profit. He would contact retailers, other merchants, or large consumers of the goods he had purchased. He might send word through the commercial networks of Rome that he had particular goods available. Interested buyers would come to inspect the goods and negotiate purchase. The selling negotiations mirrored the buying negotiations, but with roles reversed. Now the negotiator would emphasize the quality of his goods and justify his asking price. Buyers would seek lower prices, noting supposed flaws or referring to other available sources. The negotiator would need to balance getting the best price against moving inventory. Goods sitting in warehouses cost money in rent and security, and tied up capital that could be used for other purchases. The margins on individual transactions were often modest. The negotiator might purchase goods for 100 denarii and sell them for 110 or 115 denarii. This margin had to cover all his costs, transport, storage, labour, and his own time and effort, plus provide profit. But these modest per-transaction margins, multiplied across many transactions and substantial volumes of goods, could generate significant total profits. The negotiator's work required careful timing and judgment about market conditions. If he anticipated that grain prices would rise due to poor harvests, he might purchase large quantities to hold and sell later at higher prices. But if prices fell instead, he would suffer losses. If he misjudged demand for particular goods, he might be left with inventory he could not sell except at losses. Success required understanding markets, anticipating trends, and sometimes having the courage to take calculated risks. The negotiator needed relationships throughout the commercial world. He needed to know importers and producers who could supply goods. He needed to know retailers and large consumers who would purchase. He needed to know bankers who could provide credit for purchases. He needed to know shippers who could transport goods and warehouse owners who could store them. These relationships were cultivated over years and were valuable assets that helped the negotiator operate effectively. The work involved considerable travel within Rome and sometimes beyond. The negotiator would go to the ports, to warehouses scattered across the city, to meetings with buyers and sellers. He might travel to provincial areas to inspect production or arrange direct purchases from estates or workshops. This travel was time-consuming and sometimes uncomfortable, but it was necessary for conducting business effectively. The financial management of wholesale trading was complex. The negotiator needed capital to purchase goods. He might borrow from bankers to finance larger purchases, paying interest but enabling bigger deals with potentially greater profits. He needed to manage cash flow carefully, ensuring he had money available to make purchases when opportunities arose, while also collecting what buyers owed him from previous sales. Record keeping was essential. The negotiator needed to track what he had purchased, at what prices, from whom. He needed to track what he had sold, at what prices, to whom. He needed to track what was owed to him, and what he owed to others. He needed to calculate his profit or loss on each transaction, and overall. This required maintaining account books, recording transactions systematically, and periodically reviewing accounts to understand his financial position. The risks of wholesale trading were significant. Market prices could move against the negotiator, causing losses on inventory. Buyers might default on payments, leaving the negotiator with uncollectible debts. Goods might be damaged or destroyed by fire, water, theft, or vermin. Economic downturns could cause demand to collapse, leaving the negotiator with inventory he could not sell. These risks meant that some negotiators failed, losing their capital and ending in bankruptcy. but successful negotiators could become wealthy. The accumulation of profits from numerous transactions, combined with the leverage provided by borrowed capital, could generate substantial fortunes. Wealthy negotiators might own multiple warehouses, conduct business across many commodities, and employ staffs of assistants and agents. They might live in fine houses, send their sons to rhetorical schools, and mix socially with the upper classes despite their commercial background. The social status of negotiators reflected this economic success, but remained somewhat ambiguous. Trade was not as prestigious as landowning or political office, but successful merchants were respected for their wealth and business acumen. They served necessary economic functions, and their commercial expertise was valued even by aristocrats who needed their services for managing estates or financing ventures. For someone with commercial instincts, tolerance for risk, and the ability to build relationships and judge markets, the position of negotiator offered opportunity for substantial success. It was demanding work requiring intelligence, judgment, and effort, but it provided rewards proportional to success and the satisfaction of building a substantial business through one's own abilities. Chapter 13. The position of the lanista. The lanista was the owner and manager of a gladiatorial school. While the gladiatorial games are often seen through a modern lens as barbaric, in Roman times they were an accepted form of entertainment, and managing gladiators was a legitimate business. The lanista occupied an unusual social position, economically successful if the business prospered, but socially stigmatized due to association with public entertainment and violence. The lanista's primary asset was his stable of gladiators. These were slaves purchased specifically for training as gladiators, criminals condemned to the arena, or occasionally free volunteers who signed contracts to fight. The lanista would assess potential gladiators, looking for physical strength, coordination, courage, and the ability to learn fighting techniques. Training gladiators was the core function of the school. The lanista employed trainers, former gladiators who had survived to retirement or purchased their freedom. These trainers would teach fighting techniques specific to different gladiatorial styles. There were various types of gladiators: Mumilio, Throex, Retiarius, Secutor, each with distinctive armour, weapons, and fighting methods. Trainees would specialise in particular styles and train intensively in the associated techniques. The training facility included practice areas where gladiators would drill with wooden weapons that approximated the weight and balance of real weapons, but were less dangerous. They would practice strikes, blocks, parries, and footwork. They would spar with each other under the supervision of trainers. This training was rigorous and physical, conditioning gladiators for the extreme demands of arena combat. The lanista needed to maintain his gladiators in good physical condition. This required providing adequate food, more and better than ordinary slaves received, as gladiators needed to build muscle and maintain energy. It required medical care when gladiators were injured in training or in actual combats. A medicus might be employed by the school to treat injuries, set broken bones, and stitch wounds. The investment in each gladiator was substantial, and protecting that investment through proper maintenance was economically rational. The housing of gladiators was secure but austere. They lived in barracks attached to the training facility with limited freedom. Security was essential because gladiators, being trained fighters, were potentially dangerous if they escaped or rebelled. Guards watched them, as the facilities were designed to prevent escape. Despite this confinement, conditions were better than for many slaves. Gladiators were valuable, and their physical and mental state affected their performance. The Lannister's business involved contracting his gladiators for public games. When magistrates or wealthy individuals sponsored gladiatorial shows, they would contract with Lannisters to provide fighters. The Lannister would negotiate fees based on the number and quality of gladiators provided. More skilled, experienced gladiators commanded higher fees. The Lannister would select which gladiators to send to each event, balancing the desire for high fees against the risk of losing valuable fighters. Gladiatorial combat was dangerous but not always fatal. Many fights ended when one gladiator was clearly defeated but still alive. The sponsor of the games, often guided by crowd sentiment, would decide whether the defeated gladiator lived or died. If spared, the gladiator would return to the school to recover and fight again. If killed, the Lannister lost his investment in that gladiator, but would have been compensated at a higher rate for the increased risk. The financial model of a gladiatorial school required balancing investments and returns. Purchasing and training gladiators was expensive. Maintaining them, food, housing, medical care, security, involved ongoing costs, but contracting them out for games generated income. If gladiators survived multiple combats, they could earn more than their cost many times over. But early deaths meant losses on those investments. The Lannister also generated income by charging admission to the training facility. Wealthy Romans interested in gladiatorial combat might pay to watch training sessions. Aspiring fighters who wanted to learn gladiatorial techniques, but were not themselves gladiators, might pay for instruction. These ancillary revenue streams supplemented income from contracting gladiators for games. The successful Lannister needed various skills. He needed to judge physical potential when selecting new gladiators. He needed to manage a complex operation, overseeing training, maintaining facilities, managing finances, negotiating contracts. He needed relationships with those who sponsored games, ensuring his gladiators were selected for events. He needed to manage his reputation, as a school known for producing skilled fighters would receive more and better contracts. The social aspects of the position were complicated. Economically successful Lannisters could become wealthy. Their services were in demand, and they associated with wealthy and powerful Romans who sponsored games. But they were also stigmatized by association with public entertainment, which was considered somewhat degrading, and by association with the violence of the arena. They were not accepted as social equals by aristocrats, regardless of their wealth. The ethical dimensions of the business were troubling even by Roman standards. The Lannister made his living from the deaths and suffering of others. While Romans accepted gladiatorial combat as legitimate entertainment, there was nonetheless recognition that profiting from such violence was morally questionable. The Lannister often was a freedman or someone from the lower social orders. Few freeborn Romans of good family would enter such a business. Despite these complications, for someone willing to accept the social stigma and ethical concerns, operating a gladiatorial school could be financially rewarding. The business served genuine demand, Roman society wanted gladiatorial entertainment. Those who provided it, even if not fully respected, were necessary. The lanista who managed his business effectively, who trained skilled fighters, who maintained good relationships with sponsors, and who managed risks well, could achieve considerable financial success. The work itself involved both physical presence at the school, observing training, inspecting facilities, dealing with problems, and business activities, negotiating contracts, managing finances, arranging transport of gladiators to games. The lanista needed to be tough-minded, able to make hard decisions about sending men to potentially fatal combats. He needed business acumen to manage a complex operation profitably, and he needed a degree of detachment from the human cost of his business, or at least the ability to justify it within Roman cultural frameworks that accepted gladiatorial combat. Conclusion: the varied paths to comfortable living. And so we conclude our extensive, deliberately soporific examination of desirable occupations in ancient Rome. We have explored positions across the spectrum of Roman economic life, from the intellectual work of librarians and rhetors to the business activities of bankers and wholesale merchants, from the personal service of nomenclators and attendants to the skilled labour of physicians and garden managers, from administrative roles to the morally complex business of managing gladiators. These occupations shared certain appealing characteristics. They offered escape from the most brutal forms of labour, the back-breaking work in mines, the dangerous toil in heavy construction, the grinding poverty of subsistence farming, the complete lack of freedom experienced by agricultural slaves. They provided regular income sufficient to maintain decent housing, adequate food, and participation in urban social and cultural life. Most required literacy or specialized knowledge, placing practitioners in the educated minority of Roman society. This education was itself valuable, opening doors to opportunities and social connections. It allowed engagement with ideas, with texts, with the intellectual life that represented one of Rome's greatest achievements. An educated Roman, even one who worked for wages, had access to culture that was closed to illiterate labourers. The working conditions of these occupations were generally tolerable or better. Much of the work occurred indoors or in pleasant outdoor settings. The physical demands, while sometimes present, were moderate compared to heavy labour. The work engaged the mind through problem-solving, decision-making, and interaction with diverse people. This mental engagement made work interesting rather than mind-numbingly repetitive. Social status was respectable. None of these positions conferred aristocratic standing, but all placed practitioners well above the bottom layers of society. They involved providing valued services, education, medical care, financial services, agricultural management, administrative support. This service had meaning and earned respect from those who benefited from it. The economic rewards, while not making one wealthy, were sufficient for comfortable living. A successful practitioner in any of these fields could support a family, could save something for old age or emergencies, could perhaps even accumulate enough to purchase a small property or to set up children in similar or better positions. This economic security, modest by aristocratic standards, but enviable compared to poverty, was the foundation of a satisfying life. The paths to these positions varied. Some required formal education, particularly rhetoric and medicine, which meant they were only accessible to those whose families could afford to support years of study. Others required apprenticeship to learn specific skills: banking, medicine, estate management. Still others required primarily literacy and organizational ability, serving as a scribe or treasurer or administrative attendant. The variety of paths meant that different people with different backgrounds and abilities could find suitable positions. Advancement was possible in most of these careers. A successful nomenclator might become an estate manager or business agent for his patron. A capable scribe might be appointed to more significant governmental positions. A physician who developed a reputation could attract wealthy clients and earn substantial fees. A banker or merchant who managed risk well and accumulated capital could expand operations and achieve considerable prosperity. The Roman economy, while less fluid than modern economies, nonetheless offered opportunities for capable, ambitious individuals to improve their positions. The alternative to these middling positions was grimmer than modern people easily imagine. Without social safety nets, without public education, without the economic opportunities of an industrial economy, most Romans faced lives of hard physical labour for minimal reward. A position that offered intellectual engagement, comfortable working conditions, and adequate income was genuinely fortunate. The people who held these positions knew they were privileged compared to most of their contemporaries, yet these were not the positions that Roman literature celebrated. Literature focused on aristocrats, generals, great orators, and philosophers. The librarian, arranging scrolls, the banker calculating exchange rates, the nomenclator whispering names. These people appear in literature, if at all, as minor figures in their background of more important people's stories. Their daily work, their struggles and satisfactions, their ordinary lives were not considered worthy of literary attention. This literary silence about ordinary success is itself historically significant. It shows us what Romans valued and what they considered trivial: glory, power, military achievement, political success, great wealth. These were celebrated. Comfortable competence in a respectable profession was simply normal, unremarkable, not worth recording for posterity. Yet this unremarked normalcy was the actual lived experience of the successful middle layers of Roman society. We know about these positions not from celebratory texts, but from mundane sources: legal documents mentioning occupations, epitaphs recording how the deceased earned their living, administrative records showing governmental positions, passing references in letters and speeches. These scattered fragments, pieced together, reveal the structure of ordinary prosperity in ancient Rome. The comparison to modern occupations is both illuminating and limited. Modern doctors, teachers, accountants, managers, and administrators perform functions analogous to Roman physicians, rhetors, treasurers, and estate managers. The specifics differ enormously. Modern medicine is scientific, modern teaching occurs in institutionalized schools, modern accounting uses sophisticated systems, but the basic social functions are similar. Yet modern occupational life differs in fundamental ways. Modern education is widespread, making literacy universal in developed countries rather than a minority skill. Modern occupations exist in a context of economic growth and opportunity that ancient Rome, for all its achievements, never experienced. Modern social mobility, while imperfect, is far greater than anything Romans knew. and modern working conditions, regulated by labour laws and shaped by technological development, are incomparably better than ancient standards. Perhaps the most significant difference is that modern people can take comfortable prosperity for granted in a way Romans never could. The expectation that competent work will provide decent living, that education will lead to good employment, that old age need not mean destitution, these expectations, so central to modern middle-class consciousness, were not available to Romans. For them, comfortable prosperity was not a right or an expectation, but an achievement, something earned through combination of ability, effort and luck, and something that could be lost through misfortune or economic changes beyond one's control. As you drift towards sleep, consider these Romans in their various occupations, going about their daily work with the mixture of satisfaction and frustration, pride and anxiety, routine and variety that characterizes working life across the centuries. They worried about their finances, about their reputations, about their families' futures. They took pride in work well done. They dealt with difficult colleagues and demanding employers or clients. They endured tedium and sought meaning in their tasks. Their specific concerns, how to arrange scrolls in a library, how to remember hundreds of names, how to judge the quality of imported grain, how to manage gladiators, are alien to modern experience. But the underlying human realities of working life would be instantly recognizable to them if they could somehow observe modern offices, schools and workplaces. People still seek meaningful work, fair compensation, respect, and some degree of security. People still navigate relationships with supervisors and colleagues. People still balance ambition against contentment, striving against acceptance. The jobs in ancient Rome that were actually worth wanting were not dramatic positions. They were ordinary occupations performed by ordinary people who wanted ordinary things. Enough money, some respect, tolerable working conditions, a sense of purpose. These modest ambitions, repeated across millions of lives over the centuries of Roman history, sustained the civilization that produced architecture, literature, law, and administration that influenced all subsequent Western history. And with that reflection on the ordinary foundations of extraordinary civilization, we finally reach the end of our journey through Roman employment. May the detailed examination of ancient librarians, nomenclators, rhetors, bath managers, gardeners, treasurers, estate managers, physicians, scribes, attendants, bankers, merchants, and gladiatorial trainers have filled your mind with information sufficiently boring to displace any anxieties or exciting thoughts that might otherwise prevent sleep. May you rest well, perhaps dreaming of warm baths in the afternoon, or of well-ordered gardens in the morning light, or of peaceful libraries where dust motes drift in slanting sunlight through high windows. These are images of comfort and order, of civilized life lived at a human scale, of work that provides both sustenance and dignity. They are boring images, deliberately so, perfectly suited for the threshold of sleep. The ancient Romans who filled these positions are dust now, their names forgotten, their individual stories lost. But the positions themselves, the work they performed, the lives they lived, these remain visible to us across 2,000 years, showing us that human desires for security, respect, and meaningful work are constants that transcend time, culture, and the enormous changes in technology and social organization that separate our world from theirs. Sleep peacefully, knowing that throughout history, most people have simply wanted what these Roman workers achieved: decent, useful work that provides a comfortable life and some measure of dignity and respect. Nothing more needs to be said, though we have said so much more, examining every detail with deliberate thoroughness until even thinking about it induces drowsiness. Good night, and may your dreams be as peaceful and uneventful as a day in the life of a Roman librarian, organizing scrolls in a quiet room, performing useful work without drama or danger, living an ordinary life that was, precisely because of its ordinariness, a genuine success and worthy of contentment. Sleep now. And so we conclude our exhaustive, somnolent survey of desirable occupations in ancient Rome. These positions, librarian, nomenclator, rhetor, balneator, hortulanus, arcarius, villicus, medicus, scriba, and accensus, shared certain characteristics that made them attractive to Romans who were not born into wealth or aristocratic status. They required literacy or specialized knowledge, setting them apart from common labor that required only physical strength. They offered steady employment and regular compensation, providing economic security. They were respectable, conferring a degree of social status and dignity. They involved working conditions that were tolerable or even pleasant, indoors in comfortable spaces or outdoors in pleasant settings without the dangers or extreme physical demands of mining, heavy construction, or military service. None of these positions made one wealthy. No one became a senator or equestrian through working as a scribe or a nomenclator, but they provided comfortable, respectable lives. They allowed one to support a family, to maintain decent housing, to eat well, to participate in social and cultural life of the community. They offered intellectual engagement, or at least variety and interest in daily work, rather than mind-numbing repetition. The reality of life for most Romans was far harsher than these positions suggest. The majority of people in the Roman world worked in agriculture, labouring long hours in fields for subsistence or minimal surplus. Many lived in slavery without freedom to choose their work or control their lives. Urban poverty was widespread, with many people living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, working irregular jobs for minimal pay, always on the edge of destitution. Against this background, these middling positions represented success. To be a librarian surrounded by scrolls, to be a physician helping the sick, to be a garden keeping beautiful grounds, these were accomplishments worth striving for. They represented escape from the most grinding forms of poverty and labour. They provided purpose, dignity, and enough material comfort to enjoy life. The modern world offers vastly more opportunities and far greater material comfort than ancient Rome could imagine. Yet the basic human desires that made these positions attractive remain unchanged. People want meaningful work that uses their abilities. They want fair compensation that provides economic security. They want respect from others and the sense of having a valued place in society. They want working conditions that are bearable and preferably pleasant. These desires, evident in the Roman career choices we have examined, transcend time and culture. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you might reflect on these Romans pursuing their ordinary lives, the librarian arranging his scrolls, the nomenclator memorizing names, the rhetor drilling students in speech techniques, The bath manager supervising his heated pools, the gardener tending his plants, the treasurer counting coins, the estate manager organizing harvests, the physician mixing medicines, the scribe carefully forming letters, the magistrate's attendant carrying documents through the forum. These were not famous men. No monuments were erected to them. No historians recorded their deeds. But they lived their lives with purpose and dignity, performing useful work, earning their living, supporting their families, and finding satisfaction in competent performance of their chosen tasks. Their names are forgotten, their individual stories lost to history, but the positions they filled, the work they performed, and the modest prosperity they achieved remain visible across the centuries, showing us that ordinary success has always been worth pursuing, and that a good life need not be extraordinary to be worthwhile and satisfying. Sleep well, knowing that throughout history, most of what matters is not the dramatic or the exceptional, but the steady, competent performance of useful work that sustains society and provides purpose and dignity to those who perform it. The rhythm of daily tasks repeated across years and lifetimes forms the foundation of civilization, then as now, in Rome as in our own time. This continuity of ordinary effort, this persistence of competent work across millennia, is perhaps the most profoundly boring and simultaneously most important truth about human history. And so we end having spent many thousands of words describing positions that, while pleasant enough for those who held them, were fundamentally unremarkable. They were good jobs. People wanted them. They provided decent lives. Nothing more needs to be said, and yet we have said so much more, exploring every tedious detail, examining every mundane aspect, considering every ordinary dimension of these occupations, until even thinking about them induces drowsiness. May this examination of ancient employment have lulled you gently toward rest. May your mind, saturated with details of Roman work life, find no more room for anxious thoughts or wakeful worries. May you slip easily into sleep, perhaps to dream of swimming in the calm waters of a Roman bath, or walking through orderly gardens in the morning dew, or arranging scrolls in a quiet library while dust motes drift in slanting sunlight. These are peaceful images from peaceful occupations, perfect for the threshold of sleep. Good night.